So this is a meta model for metadata. All right? And it looks very different in some ways to the sorts of metadata models that we're used to seeing. And the idea is that it's a meta model. One of the things that came out of my master's research is you can go two ways with metadata schemas. You can try and imagine every permutation of what you may want to document and create entity types that kind of support that. Or you can go small and trying to figure out what's the minimum set of stuff you need to describe the world that supports interoperability and allow local variation on that doesn't affect the interoperability. Our standards at the moment encourage, and rightly so, support local definitions of things, but they do it in such a way that having created these local models, they can't actually talk to one another. Whereas this sort of model does allow interconnectivity between systems in all sorts of ways, and I'll be showing that in a little while. And the most important thing that actually came out of the master's research that isn't here is in fact that it's the relationships that are more important than the entities. So that's why there's a fairly small number of primary entity types, but quite a wealth of relationships. And it's actually the relationships that connect things that are more meaningful for interoperability and sense-making out of metadata than the actual entities themselves. Relationships are first-class entities because relationships need attributes. Right? Relationships need a name. Well, they actually don't need a name, but they may need a description, and they may need dates. In fact, they almost always need dates, and they may, in fact, need other sort of attributes as well. So relationships are first-class entities as well, but it just makes more sense in this sense to draw it that way. So instead of entities like organisation and record and agency and person, that kind of thing, from an ontological perspective, we can talk about substantial entities, which are things, physical things that exist in the world, and a special case of a substantial entity is an agent. So that's a person or a delegate of a person, which could be a program or a machine or something. There are also non-concrete entities, which are conceptual entities like organisations and companies and states and roles, and things that don't actually physically exist in the universe, but they're kind of social objects that we, through agreement, agree exist. And again, special cases of non-concrete entities are discorporate agents. So that's, companies can do things, or organisations can do things, or agencies can do things, or a role has a particular capability of doing something. There's also another special case of a non-concrete entity, which is a mandate, and we kind of understand intuitively what a mandate is. It's the authorisation. A mandate authorises something to happen. But a mandate, and this actually was introduced after reading Rick, a mandate is actually conceptually separate from any instrument that actually gives rise to the mandate. A mandate may have an instrument behind it. It may have many instruments. It may have no instrument. There may be a consensus about a mandate of some sort. So a mandate exists as a conceptual entity that may or may not be realised by some sort of instrument. It governs performances. Now the big thing here is the performance. This is something that is done. Right? Agents, whether they're corporeal agents or discorporate agents, have the ability to conduct performances. Those are things that occur in time. These things exist in space-time. They basically endure through time, but they don't have temporal parts. You can't sort of split it into particular. You don't measure it in terms of time. Performances are measured in time, and it's convenient to think of three sorts of performance. Activities, which are a bit like functions, or Chris Hurley's ambient functions, or that kind of thing. And they tend not to have dates or times associated with them. So that's things like healthcare or whatever. An event often, has one date time stamp associated with it. This happened then. Although computationally it's easy if you actually do have a start and an end of an event. But conceptually we think of an event happening at a point in time and a process that has an obvious start and end. And so agents can either be purposefully involved in a performance. They can do something, like I can remove a child and place them in care, or entities can be involved in performances. So they don't purposely do something. I was removed and put in care. So I was affected by this particular performance, but it wasn't me that purposefully went and executed or enacted this particular performance. And it's because we have agents that enact as well as agents that are involved that gives rise to competing claims for agency in the records. Yeah. There's also a setting entity which is a space-time thing, so that might be Brisbane, or it might be Brisbane in the 1920s, or some sort of context in which we may want to describe other things. So it may be a spatial coordinate with no time part, or it might be a temporal coordinate with no space-time, but in your jurisdiction you can break down these settings however you want, as long as you maintain these situated. So you can say, this performance was situated in that setting. That setting could be geographical, it could be temporal, it could be jurisdictional. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter in a lot of ways what these things are. For example, take a simple, and there's relationships with these entities themselves, right? A structural entity, like is part of, or is a member of, that kind of thing. You could have a schema that says a widget is part of a fuzit. And I may not know what a widget or a fuzit actually is. But if I understand there's a structural relationship, I can visualise that. And I can follow it, and I can understand that there are many and one and all of that kind of thing. So what the entities actually are less important in some ways than what the relationships are. Now, what's missing from there as a record-keeping metadata schema? That's right. The reason for that is that records are actually kind of in the eye of the beholder. Something that you think is a record, I may not. Something that's a collection, I might think is a record. Right? So coming back from the other model, what I contend is that every record is a representation of some performance. Something happened and a record perhaps was created that represents that performance. In particular, if there is a record, you may think it represents one performance, or I may feel it represents some other performance. The movement of Indigenous children into homes can be documented somewhere as child welfare, and in other contexts as, say, child stealing. And the actors involved may be described completely differently, and the motivations and who's affected. Again, the whole documentation may be different. There may be agreement that there is this record that represents something, but the description of the performances might be completely different. This also allows performative records as well. So if you have an oral tradition, then that admits the documentation of these oral performative records as well. And that's why we have a kind of a loop back here that a performance can represent another performance. Exactly. So this is where records would live, and we can construct arbitrary hierarchies of records. We can say this collection holds. We can do the full fond, subfond, series, record group, file, item, sub-item, whatever we want. It's not enforced, right? But these records would live in here, and everything that's here. If we have anything here that we say represents a performance, then in that particular context, that becomes a record. What this allows us to do is create schemas. So for the moment, if you have to believe me that this kind of works, I'll show you it in a moment, and allows interoperability. Right? So if we understand things are performances and other things represent those performances, irrespective of the system, we know that these things are records. And we can follow these links back and say, well, if you say this is a record, then I understand what the performance is, I can understand who the agents are, and we actually are able to create this interlinking of metadata around things that we call records that are kind of independent of the world view of who's doing the documentation. It allows us also to construct documentation of records at arbitrary levels of granularity. Right? So you might say, I consider World War II to be an event. So we create a record for it and say, or a process that was between this date and this date, and and then there's other stuff that falls out of that. Somebody else may want to actually construct World War II as an incredibly complex cluster of agents and events and processes and all sorts of stuff, with records that point out from that. That's all okay. Right? We're not actually constraining these levels of granularity at all. But everything kind of connects because we understand the semantics of all of these relationships. One of the first bits of evaluation I did was, once I constructed this and built my system, was to map existing metadata schemas back into this framework. And so I did the ABC harmony ontology, which is Jane Hunter's thing, the AGKRMS, the trade union archive. I was interested in the trade union archive because they have an interesting, they're a series system and they're quite standard in terms of, agency, function, all that kind of stuff. But they have primary entities of things like strikes and industrial action. And a strike actually isn't a function, really. But it is an event, and there are sort of people and records and things associated with that. So they've kind of shoehorned that into the kind of the function transaction kind of hierarchy. So I kind of split that out a little bit and played with that. The expert group of archival description took some notice of the Spanish metadata standard, so I mapped that in. I did Dublin Core, I did Europeana, the Finnish model as well, the existing ICA standards, the emergent EGAD records in context model, which again, I know no one in the world has seen, but I wanted to satisfy myself that I was kind of in line with that. State records, because they have a nice kind of ministry portfolio hierarchy that no one else seems to do. And the W3 Consortium provenance ontology, which is like a semantic web ontology for provenance stuff. All of those, with a bit of tweaking, I could successfully map into my metadata schema, metaschema, and with a couple of exceptions. Some of those I had to split some entity types. A lot of them have an agent that can be an organisation or a person, and I hold those two things as being conceptually different, so I had to split those things up. One of the things that came out of that mapping was that, let's go back. While you can model, so you can express all of these schemas using these constructs, it can be a bit long-winded. For example, if you wanted to say an agency owns a record, you would have to create an agency entity over here, a record entity over here, an owning performance over there, and then enactment relationship here and an involvement relationship there. So you actually have to create 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 records to say agency owns a record, which is a bit long-winded. Now, there are obviously optimizations you can do under the covers, so you could actually have a user interface that says, agency owns a record, and in the background it creates all of this stuff. But then it involves a bit of complexity in the ongoing maintenance. So one of the things was the idea of having these general is associated with relationships all over the place. So everything, any entity type can be associated with any other entity type. Because sometimes you just don't know the detail. You know that these records have something to do with this person, but you don't really, without going into detail, know what that relationship actually is. So I kind of discounted it at first, but talking with Daniel and some others convinced me that it's a useful thing. And in fact, there's 3 subtypes of associated. There's kind of an influence relationship, which is like owns, controls, acquires, disposes, all of those sort of verby kind of things. A reference, which is saying, these records refer to this thing, without actually knowing what the performance was and who all the actors were. And a kind of a authorise, a mandating kind of way. So you can say, this organisation authorised this thing to happen without actually, again, thinking what was the performance, what was the mandate, what were the instruments, all of that kind of thing. So I've termed these low fidelity relationships because they're actually less meaningful in some ways than these first class relationships. But I think they're necessary to make it less long-winded and to actually capture some of the information we know about the world we're trying to document without actually being forced to go into the detail of creating all of these other types.